did it.
Okay, so we
And I
can,
think everything is set now. You
okay,
start recording?
yeah. So I start
Okay.
recording and I think everyone is muted and Brad, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
So we're starting with 2024 presentations and we have full schedule until summer. With one spot missing. So if you have suggestions, please send us. And we have several spots already planned after summer before New Year. So today it's a great pleasure to introduce Brad Foley from Penn State University. Brad did his undergraduate at University of Southern California, close to us here. And at that time, he already started to work on mantle convection. He followed with master and PhD at Yale, working with under David Berkovich, continuing with mantle convection, early plate tectonics, and effect of plate tectonics on climate. He have been a postdoc at Carnegie Institution for Science for 2 years, and after it started position at Penn State. And his current research is focused on mantle dynamics, initiation of plate tectonics, and impact on climate of Earth and other planets. And it's a pleasure to introduce Brad, and floor is yours.
Okay, great. First of all, everyone can hear me okay? All right, I'm not hearing any.
You're good.
Excellent. All right, I'm gonna hide the video bar here. Okay, yeah, so yeah, it's great to be here. Actually coming to you from a kind of dreary Zurich, Switzerland, where I'm on sabbatical for a few months here. So good evening from Zurich. And yeah, I'm excited to show some actually some really new work from my group and myself, looking at really trying to integrate some observations of early Earth crust formation with geodynamic models and really trying to test some different scenarios for how the early Earth crust formed, right? Which then ultimately tying into important implications for the kind of tectonic processes that might have been happening on the early Earth. Right, and so I'm starting off here with a picture of the ancient rocks in the Akata Gneiss complex because a lot of the observations we get from this very earliest portion of continental crust that we know of forming on Earth, has really kind of inspired some of the ideas and models that then led to the kind of modeling I did to try to test some different scenarios for how very early Earth crust could have formed. Right, and actually, I always feel like I'm doing a little bit of a stolen valor here because I'm a geodynamicist, right? And so I have not actually been out to the Akata Gneiss complex and taken beautiful pictures like this. This is from my colleague, Jesse Rymick, who I'll talk a lot about some of his work that helped motivate the modeling I'll show. He's the one who went out and braved the swarms of black flies and mosquitoes while I, of course, can sit in my climate controlled office and work on equations and computers all summer. But, we need both of these approaches to really make progress on understanding the Earth's evolution. Right, I want to quickly acknowledge some collaborators. Right, so I already mentioned Jesse Rymick. He's one of my colleagues at Penn State. He's a real expert in the geology, geochemistry, petrology of early Earth crust formation. I also will show some work that's collaboration with Annie Bauer from the University of Wisconsin, bringing the same kind of expertise. And then I want to acknowledge some student workers of mine who are really leading some of the parts of the work that I'll show. Right, so a lot of the work I'll show in the first part of the talk is being led by a current graduate student of mine, Yusuke Kubota. And I also want to acknowledge a former undergraduate, Sean Lee Liu, sorry, who is now a PhD student at the University of California, Davis, and did some of the kind of groundwork that we are building on now to look at topics around early Earth crust formation. Okay, so a big picture motivation for this, and really a lot of my work throughout, even going back to Andre mentioned when I was an undergrad at USC, is trying to understand the style of tectonics that develops on Earth and other planets. Right? And actually, if you look just in our solar system, it's kind of an amazing array or range of different tectonic styles that we see. Right? Things range from, of course, plate tectonics like we have on Earth, right? A stagnant lid, like it's probably happening on Mars or Mercury, where you've got essentially one rigid plate covering the whole planet and just mantle convection happening beneath that. You can have variations of this, like Io, the very volcanically active moon of Jupiter, due to intense tidal heating, right? And this leads to really rapid volcanism resurfacing, right? And this is something that has been applied to the early Earth as well as a possibility, and we'll talk about that as I get into some of the main work we're doing, right? And then there's even kind of different, almost like hybrid or intermediary types of regimes, right? Like episodic lid, going back and forth between mobile lid and stagnant lid. Some have proposed that melting, extensive melting, can lead to some sort of block kind of mobility, a squishy lid, right? And actually a planet like Venus, it's not totally clear where to place Venus within this range of different tectonic styles, right? We know it's not plate tectonics, but is it really a stagnant lid? Has it gone through episodic behavior? These are things we're not really sure, right? And hopefully we'll learn more with some new Venus missions coming up in the next decade. Right, so we have this kind of amazing diversity of tectonic styles that we can see just looking at our solar system, right? And then try to model and understand what controls where these different styles develop. Right, but then of course, a really related question that really dovetails with this is whether we see a similar type of diversity throughout Earth's history, right? Whether we've always had plate tectonics, whether we've shown some of these other styles of tectonics, like a heat pipe or a stagnant lid or a platonic squishy lid, before eventually settling into the modern style plate tectonics we have today, right? And this is just a nice summary figure showing a range of different onset times for the start of plate tectonics that have been proposed throughout the geologic literature over the years based on various types of observations that people have made, right? And you can see it covers a huge range, anything from arguments that plate tectonics started very earlier in Earth's history during the Hadean to the other extreme member that plate tectonics might not have started until very recently, only a billion years ago or so. Right, and so I like how these problems are really connected. So we study the Earth, right? We also generally understand tectonic behavior on planets in general, right? And this kind of grand question of what caused plate tectonics on Earth compared to the other planets. All right, so of course there's a huge range of different types of observations and constraints we can bring to this problem. I'm going to really focus for most of this talk on the formation of felsic crust or continental crust on the early Earth, right? And so as I'm sure most of this audience is well familiar with, right, the early Earth crust is really dominated by this particular type of rocks, the TTG suite, tonalite-granodiorite suite of rocks, right? And we see these really commonly in Archean continents, right? Less commonly today, right? So there's been a lot of work on the kind of petrological processes that would lead to forming TTGs, right? So lots of experimental metrology work, right? And the general idea is that it's been pretty well shown that TTGs are expected to form by melting hydrated basalt, right? Within particular pressure temperature ranges, right? And these PT ranges can be estimated based on things like, one, just the measuring and constraining where the wet solidus is that we need to take this hydrated basalt across to get it to melt, right? And also we'll see a little bit more about this, that some of the detailed geochemistry of the rocks, like rare earth element patterns, can also provide some constraints on formation pressures. All right, so of course there's been lots of work on the different ways that TTGs could form, right, from different kinds of tectonic models, right? And I'm going to kind of really lump them together, right, and really just talk about two types of end members here: subduction models or non-subduction models, right? And think about ways we can try to test these, right? So in a subduction model, the basic idea is that on the early Earth, right, a subducting slab may have followed a hotter geotherm due to having a hotter mantle for the slab to sink into, right? And if you can get this downgoing crust, right, to melt in the right PT range, then you can form TTGs that way. All right, the other end member of this would be I'm going to call this plateau melting model for a kind of non-subduction model, right? And the idea here is that we form a thick kind of crustal plateau through some sort of extensive or repeated basaltic magmatism, right? And then through this kind of magmatism, we can take hydrated crust, the form of the surface, bury it under subsequent lava flows, and get it deep enough to where it can potentially remelt, again, within this kind of PT range to form TTGs, right? And there's a number of different variations of this, some of which we'll touch on, where you could have, this process dominated by lots of extrusive magmatism, right? Burying crust down. Intrusive magmatism might be playing an important role in leading to melting, remelting of the hydrated mafic crust. Foundering of a lithosphere might be important as well, right? Lots of interesting different processes, all kind of grouped into what I'm calling this plateau melting model. All right, and then an important distinction between these, of course, is that if we're forming TTGs by subduction, right, that implies at least some form of like mobile lid style tectonics, right? While a plateau melting model does not require subduction or any sort of mobile lid tectonics. So this could readily happen in, say, a stagnant lid regime. All right, I want to highlight another kind of version, I would say, of the plateau melting model, kind of an extreme version, right? And this is something that actually some of the work I'll show here, we'll get back to trying to test whether this scenario makes sense, right? And that's a heat pipe early Earth, right? So this is from Bill Moore and Alex Webb, and it was really inspired by looking at the tectonics of Io, right? Where Io being an example of a body that's experiencing extreme heating, right? From tidal heating on Io, right? But the early Earth, due to high rates of internal heating and high mantle temperatures, might have been in a similar state, right? So in this case, we have extensive, widespread volcanism, right, throughout the planet due to high temperatures in the mantle, right? That's causing lots of extrusive volcanism. So we're basically piling up lots of mafic crust, right? And that's burying the pre-existing crust down and creating actually a very thick, cold lid and thick, cold crust, right? And this burial of crust could potentially then lead to remelting, right, of hydrated crusts that interact with water at the surface to form TTGs, right? And I'll just point out here, because this will be important later on in the talk, then an important characteristic of the heat pipe model, right, is the idea that this extensive eruption, right, and cooling of magma at the surface then forms a major heat loss mechanism for the Earth, right? So that actually heat is getting out of the Earth through volcanism rather than primarily through convection that then leads to conductive cooling across the lithosphere. All right, so how do we get into testing these? I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the observations from the Acosta Gneiss complex, right? And I'm mainly going to talk about some work from my colleague at Penn State, Jesse Remick, right? And then ultimately how this motivates some modeling, right? They'll help test some different ideas, right? So Jesse has looked at the oldest TTGs in the Acosta Gneiss complex, right, that date back to almost about 4 billion years old, right? So it's like the oldest whole rocks we have from the early Earth, right? At least that are well agreed upon. And what Jesse's argued is, so first, if he looks at the rare earth element patterns, right, of these TTGs, right, he sees that the oldest ones, so things older than about 3.6 GA, right, show a pattern that fits within this range of rocks called Icelandites, right? So rocks that are thought to form from a similar kind of plateau melting type of mechanism in modern day Iceland, right? And this ultimately leads to a depth constraint. So basically to form this kind of rare earth element pattern, it requires that we're shallow enough that garnet is not stable in the residue yet, right? So maybe something like less than 30 kilometers, right? So this shows relatively shallow melting to form the earliest patches of the Acosta Gneiss complex, and then from 3.6 billion years on, indicating deeper melting. Right, so then another important tool with this that both Jesse and Andy Bauer have worked on, right, and then that kind of then connected me into some of these observations, is the lutetium hafnium system, right, and measuring hafnium isotopes, right? So here's the terrifying part of the talk where you have to listen to a geodynamicist talk about radiogenic isotopes, right? So basically we're using the lutetium hafnium system, right? So 176 lutetiums decaying to 176 hafnium, right? Producing radiogenic hafnium, right? And then we can measure the ratio of this 176 hafnium to the non-radiogenic 177 hafnium, right? And so, a reservoir like the, say, bulk silicate Earth that we can often try to represent with the chondritic reservoir would just be increasing its 176, 177 hafnium ratio over time. Right, then what helps us really learn some new things about crust formation in the early Earth, right, is the way things partition during melting, right? So when we partially melt the mantle and extract a chunk of crust, right, lutetium and hafnium are both incompatible elements, right? But the hafnium is more incompatible. So the crust that we form has a lower lutetium-hafnium ratio. And because of that lower lutetium-hafnium ratio, it basically picks up less of the radiogenic 176 hafnium over time as lutetium decays to hafnium, right? And it ends up following this kind of shallower slope than the chondritic reservoir representing bulk silicate earth would. Right, complementary to that will then be a depleted mantle reservoir where things work the opposite way, that would then show a steeper slope, right, in this space. Right, and then the geochemists tend to convert this into an epsilon hafnium notation. So now we just subtract out this chondritic reservoir evolution to find that as 0 and look at variations away from that. Right, so now the evolution that some packet of crust will follow after it forms and is extracted from the mantle and say just sits at Earth's surface isolated from the mantle, right, will look something like this, right? It'll get increasingly negative over time, right? Because it's just sitting there, right, having its, essentially like lower ratio of lutetium decaying to hafnium over time, right? And picking up kind of relatively less radiogenic hafnium over time than the chondritic mantle would. Okay, so then in Archean rocks, right, we can measure these hafnium isotopes in zircons and use this to relate back to essentially the kind of evolution that the mafic protocrust, right, would have followed, right, before it's remelting to then form the felsic crust that we see today in, say, the tectonics complex, right? So here's some observations again that Jesse Rymick made. Right, and it's showing that for these earliest rocks, so everything older than 3.6 Ga and Acosta, right, there's this negative sloping epsilon hafnium trend. Right, it looks just like the cartoon I drew, right, of this kind of crustal evolution isolated from the mantle. Right, so an interpretation of this would be that we formed these earliest patch of felsic rocks in the Acosta complex from remelting some piece of Hadean crust that formed very early in Earth's history, and then we just kept tapping, kept remelting different portions of that, right? All, like basically all of these felsic rocks are coming from remelting that same chunk of protocrust, right? And this trend coincides with this period where we also see indications of shallower melting based on the rare earth element patterns. Right, then there's this shift, right, at about 3.6 J, where now we have some of the juvenile crust coming in, right, from the hafnium isotope values shifting back towards around 0 epsilon hafnium, right? And this also coincides with the shift to deeper melting based on the rare earth element patterns. Right, and then interestingly, it looks like a pattern like this, at least in the hafnium isotopes reported in zircons, is seen globally, right? So then Jesse and Annie Bauer, and then they wrote me in to work on this as well and think about some of the geodynamic implications, right? Looked at a global data set of hafnium isotope observations from zircons from a bunch of different cratons, right? And found a similar kind of trend where we see things dominated by negative epsilon hafnium values, right, generally kind of sloping downwards over time, right, and then the appearance of more like 0 epsilon hafnium values indicating juvenile crust production variably between about 3.8 and 3.6 billion years, with a little bit of scatter between different cratons. Okay, and so then the interpretation of this, right, is here. So we interpreted this as indicating formation of this very earliest phase of continental crust in different cratons up until about 3.8 to 3.6 billion years ago, and some sort of plateau melting type of model, right? Followed by some sort of underthrusting, maybe subduction mechanism to form the crust after about 3.6 Ga, where we see this shift to about 0 epsilon hafnium indicating melting of juvenile protocrust, right? And at least in the Acosta complex, some indication that the melting is happening deeper. Right? Okay, so this is then a picture that I wanted to test with some models, right? And in particular, what I'm really going to focus on is actually this earliest phase, right? So this is about 4.0 to 3.8 to 3.6 billion year trend, right? And see what kind of scenarios can produce TTGs, right, in this kind of setting, and match this kind of continuous, like downward sloping negative epsilon hafnium trend. Right, and in particular, what we're really going to be able to test from this is trying to constrain what kind of, say, rates of volcanism, extrusive or intrusive volcanism, right? Thinking about some TTG being formed in a plateau melting scenario like this, right, are going to be compatible with the hafnium isotope observations, right? And so we'll be able to test, whether something like a heat pipe that would have really extensive volcanism, right, can explain these observations or not, or if we need maybe a more muted type of volcanism and what that might mean for the overall type of dynamics that was happening on the early Earth. Right, so this is what my student, Yusuke Kubota, is working on. So we set up a very simple 1D model, right, where we're thinking of a situation where we've got some early formed protocrust, right, which we assume to be a hydrated mafic crust, right? And then we're going to look at what happens as we start essentially turning volcanism on to thicken this into a crustal plateau, right? And then look at the evolution of remelting of this to form TTGs, and also the epsilon hafnium that would result from the TTGs we form, right? So we have an initially formed protocrust, right? Then we turn on volcanism, right, at imposed rates, and we split this between extrusive volcanism. It starts piling up on top of our protocrust and shoving this whole column down. And we can have intrusive volcanism coming in as essentially like little sills into this thickening plateau as well, right? And so over time, what's going to happen is we're going to start burying this initially hydrated protocrust, right? We're calculating the geotherm through this plateau, and we can track when it starts to melt to form TTGs, right? And calculate the hafnium isotope evolution. Right? Okay, so what's going to cause melting within this plateau to form TTGs, right? There's basically two ways this can happen. One is we take hydrated crust at the surface, right, and we bury it down deep enough along the geotherm it's following that it eventually crosses basically the wet solidus, right, and would start melting this hydrated basalt. The other way we can get melting is from intrusions, right? So we're assuming that we've got intrusions that can be randomly put in, right, throughout the model based on a imposed rate of intrusive versus extrusive volcanism, right? And these supply heat as well, right? So we can have a region that was initially too cold to melt, but intrusion comes in and causes some essentially contact heating around it and leads to a bit of melting there as well. I'll also point out here, so I don't forget, that we're only looking at melting of the hydrated crust, right? So we assume that our initial protocrust is hydrated. We assume that extrusive crust gets hydrated because it can interact with water at the surface, but all the intrusive cells that are coming in are going to be dehydrated, right, and not able to melt to form TTGs. Also, once a packet of crust goes through melting to produce a TTG, it will also be dehydrated and not melt anymore. All right, so we can run this model by imposing a rate of rate of total like volcanic melt production. We then partitioned this into an assumed rate of extrusive versus intrusive eruption, right? And we're going to vary those parameters, and also the thickness of our initial protocrust, right? So there's three main free parameters that we're then going to vary through a big sweep of models and see what types of models lead to results that can match the sets of observations we have, right? Okay, and so here's one example model, right? And this is actually an example model that I'll show you, which doesn't explain the observations very well. So this would be an example of a failed model, but it helps show the basic ideas of what happens, right? So we take this model, right? When we first essentially turn on volcanism, right? So now we're having some intrusive volcanism happening, we're having extrusive volcanism happening and bearing this whole packet down, right? We first start melting this initial protocrust layer. And since it's initial protocrust, we assume all formed at some certain time, right? Back early in the Hadean. As we keep melting this initial protocrust, we produce, right, this negative epsilon hafnium sloping trend, right? Just like we saw in the observations for the Tectonic complex, right? So we call this the continuous remelting period, when we're continuing to remelt this originally formed protocrust. right, eventually we get to a point where we've basically taken this entire protocrust layer and buried it so deep, right? Now the whole thing is experienced melting, right? And at that point, we start melting the crust that was originally extruded, right, as like new lava flows on top of this original protocrust. And once that happens, right, the epsilon hafnium evolution follows a different trend. It starts to flatten out. We don't continue to go down to more and more negative epsilon hafnium values, right? And that's because essentially the residence time of this extrusive crust that we're starting to melt, right, is basically constant, right? So we're forming this extrusive crust, we're bearing it down to a given depth, which is usually, in the 30-kilometer range, right, kind of consistent with the shallower melting seen in the Costa complex, right? And if this is happening under a relatively uniform rate of extrusive and intrusive volcanism, right? So it basically takes about the same amount of time for a newly formed packet of crust to make it down to its melting depth and remelt, right? So there's only a certain amount of time for this epsilon hafnium evolution to occur, right? And they basically we end up with kind of a lower bound on this, right? So the epsilon hafnium trend flattens out because we're just remelting this extrusive crust in kind of a conveyor belt type of system, right? So this is a really zoomed in view. You can see in this more zoomed out view that even if you just kept this process going for a very long time, right, we don't continue to follow the downward sloping to more and more negative epsilon hafnium values that we see in the observations, right? Okay, so then what matters, right? So I mentioned there are basically three main parameters that are really important for this. There's the initial crust thickness, initial protocrust thickness. There's the rate of overall melt production that we're assuming in the model. And then there's the partitioning this between intrusive and extrusive volcanism, right? So anything that will basically prolong this burial process, right, of the initial protocrust is going to help prolong this negative sloping epsilon hafnium trend, right? Because it allows us to continue to remelt this initially formed protocrust for longer and longer, right? So a thicker protocrust or a lower extrusive melt eruption rate, right, due to either less total melt eruption or more intrusive magmatism, right, will help make this trend last longer and longer, like we see in the real observations, right? And then conversely, things that would make models less successful, thinner protocrust or really high rates of extrusive melt eruption, we just bury this initial protocrust too quickly to produce a really long-lived, increasingly negative epsilon hafnium trend, right? Okay, so those are the main parameters we vary in the model, right? And then we wanted to check this against the observation in the course, right? So we set a set of criteria for what is going to count as a successful model. And this is mainly inspired by what we see in the Costa complex, where we've got lots of good data on both the kind of constraints on like the melting conditions from the whole rock petrology, as well as the hafnium isotope observations, right? So we want to see a long-lived negative sloping epsilon hafnium trend like this, right, of say at least like 300 million years, right, maybe even a little longer really for the Costa complex, but we set 300 million years as kind of a conservative lower bound. Melting should be relatively shallow, right, so that we would stay out of the field of garnet stability in the residue. So we used about 30 kilometers as a threshold, right? I know that can vary a little bit based on the kind of assumed composition of the protocrust, right? But it's give it a good guide for testing the models, right? And then this is probably not the most important one, but we wanted to have this in anyway, is a relatively constant production of felsic crust without huge gaps of like many hundreds of millions of years where basically nothing is happening, right? Which we think is also seen in the observations we have. Right, so we ran models and looked for things that met these success criteria, right? And then looked at the control parameters that allowed us to do this, right? So what I plotted here are just the successful models. So these are histograms of the input parameters we use in the successful models, right? Where we've got the total melt production rate, right? The extrusive melt eruption rate, the intrusive to extrusive ratio. So 1 means entirely intrusive magmatism, 0 means entirely extrusive magmatism, right? And really this combined with this give you this extrusive ratio, right? Actually, it would really be this times 1 minus the intrusive ratio. right? And then here's the initial protocrust we used that led to successful models, right? And then we ultimately calculated the heat flux we get out of this because that's an important part of testing against things like the heat pipe model. All right, so basic idea as we could kind of conceive conceptually with the example model, right, is that in order to produce this long-lived negative sloping epsilon Hadean trend that we see in the data, right, we need pretty muted, pretty small rates of surface extrusive magmatism, right? So we have to always be less than we found about 0.1 millimeters per year in terms of the extrusive eruption rate, right? Otherwise, we'd just be burying this protocrust too fast, and we wouldn't be able to produce the trend we see in the observations. Right? All right, and this can be achieved by various ranges of total melt production, although these are still relatively low, right? So we can't really get anything to work if we have more than a millimeter per year of total melt production in the system, right? And more intrusive magmatism versus extrusive helps, right? Because if we have things coming in as intrusions, right? These intrusions are happening kind of throughout this thick crustal pile, and it doesn't lead to the same kind of rapid burial and loss of the initial protocrust the way the extrusive magmatism does. All right, interestingly, the initial protocrust thickness actually doesn't make a huge difference, right? So we see basically the whole range of values we tested leads to a large range of successful models. There's maybe a little bit of favoring thicker protocrust, which would make sense. It should be easier to keep that around and keep remelting it if it's thicker. But the protocrust doesn't seem to be a huge control. Instead, it's really all about the melt eruption rates and melt production rates. All right, so then if we compare this to something like the heat pipe model, right, then you can see that the melt eruption that allows us to match the hafnium isotope data is much, much less than what the heat pipe model would favor in terms of what's needed to kind of balance out Earth's heat budget, with this idea that extensive eruption of magma at the surface is the thing that's really allowing Earth to lose its heat, right? So that for a heat pipe model, we'd expect something like 1 to 10 millimeters per year of surface eruption and resurfacing rate, and we need to be much below that to match the observations, right? Similarly, we can look at the heat flow we get through the one-dimensional crustal plateau we're envisioning, right? And this heat flow ends up being around 70 to 100 milliwatts per meter squared, really similar to the modern day Earth, right? So it's not allowing us to get lots and lots of heat out of the Earth, right? Because we can't do lots and lots of extrusive eruption, otherwise we wouldn't be able to match the hafnium isotope observations well. Okay, so this then has interesting implications for Earth's heat budget, right? And how Earth's evolution, thermal evolution would behave, right? So an interesting then kind of end member is we can imagine how would Earth's heat budget work if basically the entire planet was covered in these crustal plateaus, right? And the heat we're getting out of the system from one, heat flowing through this plateau, but also the heat we can get out from eruption is basically all the heat loss that Earth can do, right? So if we take I'll even take the upper end of the heat flow range we found, right, about 100 milliwatts per meter squared, 0.1 watts per meter squared. If you integrate that across Earth's whole surface, doing just kind of a back of the envelope calculation, you get that we can lose about 50 terawatts of heat, right? Which actually, I said this is similar to the heat flux on the modern Earth, and we think that the Earth is losing, something like 45 or so terawatts of heat today. Right, but in the early Earth, if we look at estimates of heat production based on models of bulk silicate Earth, right? So combining what's now stored in continents back into the whole mantle, right? Because we're looking at this time when the continents are presumably first growing, right? We can have much more heat production, something like up to 100 terawatts, right? So if we have then like a 50 terawatt heat imbalance, right? Much more heat being produced than we can get out of the system, right? Then the Earth would be heating up, right? And actually doing this would cause the Earth, if this imbalance just stayed fixed over time, right, would cause the Earth to heat up very rapidly, right? So this imbalance would lead to something like 300 Kelvin per billion year heating, right? And that's much faster than even models like Corinaga and this comparison to data from Claude Hertzberg would predict for a potentially warming early Earth, right? And I think that has interesting implications, right? Because if we can't get this lots of heat out of the Earth through melting like the heat pipe model would have predicted, right? Then it raise the question of how do we balance out Earth's heat budget, right? And I actually think that implies that we need to be getting heat out in regions away from where these plateaus are, right, where internal differentiation is happening, kind of faster than you might expect for stagnant lid convection or processes like that, right? So I think this heat budget argument implies that there might need to be some way to get more heat out, potentially some type of more active lid type of tectonics happening outside the regions where we have this plateau melting happening, right? Okay, and actually, before I move on to the next part of the talk, I'm just curious about how much time am I expected to take, or how much time do we have?
It's typically 45 minutes to talk and one questions, but you can go over time. It's no problem.
Okay, yeah. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, right, and actually talk about whether we could potentially have some type of surface mobility on the early Earth that might help solve this heat budget imbalance, right? From now the perspective of looking at like global scale geodynamic models on the early Earth, right? And I should be able to get through this in the next like 10 or 15 minutes, right? Okay, so to start off, to be able to kind of speculate on early Earth geodynamics, right? I want to start by talking about the general problem of generating plate tectonics from mantle convection, right? Because this is really what roots us in then trying to make predictions about what early Earth tectonics could have looked like from a geodynamic perspective, right? So in order to generate plate tectonics from mantle convection on Earth or really any other planet that might have this, right, we really need to solve an important problem, which is that we need to be able to weaken the lithosphere, right? So if you take what we know the most about the rheology of rocks, right, which is that they're very strongly temperature dependent, and just use this in models of mantle convection, we basically always pop out this result. This is stagnant lid convection, right? So we get a very high viscosity lithosphere where temperatures are cold. And because the viscosity is so high in these regions, places where there's like a cold drip trying to come off the base of the lithosphere that in a plate tectonic regime could develop into a full-fledged subduction zone, right? So this cold drip is kind of trying to pull down on the lithosphere above, right? But the lithosphere is so high viscosity and so rigid, it can resist this sinking motion. And we end up just getting dripping, right? And the kind of behavior of convection confined to the region beneath the lid, like we get in stagnant lid convection, rather than developing a full-fledged subduction zone. Right, so what do we need? We know we need some sort of mechanism in the rheology that kind of consistently allows a weak zone to dynamically form, right, in this kind of region, right? So if we had a rheology where we can now weaken this strong rigid lithosphere in a region where a drip like this is forming, right, then we get rid of this viscous resistance and we can get things to sink and start moving, right? And that's how we end up developing plate tectonic styles of convection. Okay, there's tons of work on this over really many decades. Lots of different mechanisms and types of rheologies have been proposed. So of course, I definitely don't have time to review all of them. Instead, I'm going to really just focus on one that I favor, and we'll look at implications of this kind of behavior for the early Earth. And this is basing the mechanism for forming these weak zones that serve as the plate boundaries through grain size reduction, right? So this is really motivated by what we see in the field. So if you go look at places where shear zones, like the ductile roots of fault zones, have been exhumed to the surface, we very commonly see regions of really extreme grain size reduction. And so you see like mylonites, we've got really tiny grains in these gray regions, or even ultramylonites, where grains can be reduced down to micron, even slightly submicron size. All right, we also know from experimental work that this grain size reduction also leads to weakening when rocks are deforming in the diffusion creep or some sort of grain size sensitive flow regime, right? So we do lots of grain size reduction and then make the rocks weaker as a result, right? And that is a mechanism that can allow us to form very localized, very weak shear zones that can serve as plate boundaries. Okay, I'm going to do something rare for myself, which is actually skip the equations and just talk about them conceptually. But basically, what I've done in a lot of previous work of mine in trying to model both tectonics on present-day Earth, but also the early Earth, is then include a formulation for this grain size effect into models of mantle convection. And this is built off a theory called grain damage theory. Stuff that my PhD advisor, Dave Berkovici, had done lots and lots of work on over many years. All right, and the basic idea of this is we look at the evolution of grain size in the mantle, right, based on two main processes, one driving grain size down, right, causing the damage, right, and another process by which grains can grow back and basically heal themselves and heal these weak zones. Right, and so to formulate how grain size reduction happens physically, right, we think about the energetics, right, because actually you can physically describe the process of grain size reduction, right, by thinking about this as increasing the surface energy of some volume of rock, right? So when we go from like the top picture, where we've got a certain volume with a bunch of bigger grains, and we turn that into a bunch of tiny grains, right? What we've done is we've effectively increased the surface energy in this volume of rock, right? So if we're increasing the surface energy, right, as the description of reducing the grain size, we then of course need an energy source to drive this grain size reduction, to take that energy and put it into surface energy, right? And that's a source term called the deformational work. So this is the work done when you start deforming really any material, right? In a viscous sense, this also leads to what you consider viscous dissipation, which can also lead to heating, right? So basically, we just take a small fraction of that deformational work and allow that to partition into increasing the surface energy. All right, so that's a process that can drive grain size down. Right, this gets counteracted by grain growth, right? So if you just leave a very fine grained rock on its own to stop deformation, it will slowly want to have its grains grow, right, to reduce this high surface energy, right? And this process happens faster at warmer temperatures than at cooler temperatures. Okay, so if we take this kind of physics and include it in mantle convection models, and we can produce mobile lid style tectonics, right? Things that look kind of like plate tectonics with downwellings like subduction zones and mobile plates at the surface, right? And this is an example of that. So I'll show a couple plots like this. So I'll walk through what we're seeing. So the top I'm plotting as a line plot the surface velocity in this 2D model. The positive numbers mean flow to the right, negative numbers mean flow to the left, right? So we've got something like a plate here moving to the right, another kind of plate-like chunk moving to the left, so they're converging here in the middle, right? The next field is the inverse grain size, which we call fineness, right? So where we see high levels of this, then we have very small grains, right? So in this region where these essentially plates are converging, we're doing lots of this damage and grain size reduction, and we're shrinking the grain size down, leading to high fineness, right? And the same over here, right? This then leads to a viscosity reduction, right? So we've got high viscosities in the kind of rigid plate interiors due to the cold temperatures, but then in this actively deforming shear zone that's acting as a plate boundary, we're getting lots of grain size reduction, and that's lowering the viscosity. And that's what really then allows this convergence and downwelling to occur, right? And then here's the temperature field, which is probably the easiest one to look at, where you can see we've got some cold downwellings developing, right, driving the surface motion we see at the surface. And this would be like a divergent plate boundary here. Okay, so how does this develop, right? Basically, we need a couple of things. We need relatively vigorous convection, right, that provides this deformational work energy source to reduce grain size, right? And it also really helps to have slow grain growth in the lithosphere, which naturally happens from planets like Earth, where the surface temperature is relatively cold, right? So these things come together to work pretty well for explaining mobile lid behavior on the Earth, right? At least the modern Earth. Right, and so then a question I've looked at in some past work is, how would this change if we change the internal heating rate? So if we went to a higher internal heating rate, higher mantle temperature like we'd expect on the early Earth. Right, and so here's some different examples going from lower internal heating rates to higher internal heating rates, right? And what we see is we actually always stay in a mobile lid style of behavior, right? So we don't switch to like a stagnant lid, but the style of subduction that develops is very different, right? So as we start increasing the internal heating rate, right, say from here up to this highest value, instead of seeing a more coherent cold downwelling, like a coherent slab sinking down to the mantle, right, instead, it starts to turn into a bunch of little drips, right, especially like you can see here, right? So we've got downwelling happening from the surface, sort of like a little kind of nose of a subduction zone, right? But then it keeps tearing off and breaking into little drips that then sink down through the rest of the mantle. So we're losing the ability to form a really coherent subduction zone. And the reason is that as we increase the mantle temperature, we're developing essentially a weaker mantle interior, right? At the same time that the plate boundary here that we're forming through damage is staying at about the same strength, right? So we kind of create this larger and larger mismatch between the weakness of the plate boundary and how weak the mantle interior is, right? So for these very hot mantles, right, the behavior we're getting is we've got a slab that's sinking down, right? It feels very little resistance to it sinking from the mantle interior, but it does feel some relative resistance from the plate boundary, right? So it starts to want to pull apart, tear and neck into these little drips. All right, here's a nice movie of this. So you get these kind of repeating cycles of little drips coming off this kind of nose of subduction, but we do still stay in an overall mobile lid type of state, right? So this is something that, wouldn't really look like modern style plate tectonics we have on the Earth, but it's not a stagnant lid either. Okay, so this type of behavior also has a really interesting potential implication, again, for the formation of felsic crusts and TTGs, right? So that's the last main thing I'll show here as I wrap up. And what I was motivated to look at this is if we look at other models of early Earth subduction, right? Lots of other models, instead of really like trying to solve for the full plate generation physics and allowing the plate boundaries to evolve with their own strength as the model evolves. Another kind of approach, right, which is a perfectly reasonable approach for looking at various aspects of subduction dynamics, is to instead basically impose a plate boundary, a weak zone, right, at a subduction zone like this, right? But basically you're just assuming that you can always form some weak plate boundaries that provide basically no real resistance to slab sinking, and then see what happens, right? And this has been done by a few different authors. And a really interesting finding, which is highlighted in this Perchuk et al. Paper, is that if you do this for early Earth type of conditions, a hotter mantle, then a subducting plate sinks really, really steeply and rapidly, right? So because the mantle interior is low viscosity and weak, right, you get a plate subducting and it just wants to plow down really fast and really steeply, right? That means that actually this presents a big problem for the hot subduction model of forming TTGs that I mentioned at the start of the talk, right? Because of a plate sinking down really fast, right? It's not necessarily going to have time to actually heat up as it goes, even with a hotter mantle, right? And be able to melt the downgoing crust, right? So what this Perchuk et al. Paper found is that the geotherm the sinking crust followed was actually colder than it would in a modern style subduction regime because it was sinking so fast, right? But like I was just showing earlier, I think models like this miss this potential feedback where the strength of the plate boundaries themselves could be evolving, right? So I was really interested then to check whether this kind of sluggish and drip-like style of subduction I see that wants to kind of naturally arise when we apply the grain damage type mechanism for plate tectonics to the early Earth, if that could actually help solve this problem and allow plates to sink more slowly into the early Earth mantle, heat up more, and potentially still have downgoing crusts that can melt to form TTGs, right? Okay, so I did this with a very simple model setup, right? So basically I envisioned a simple setup like this where we've got a sinking plate with some imposed thickness delta, right? It's got a damaged shear zone plate boundary at the surface evolving following the damage theory equations, right? And basically I'm just going to calculate the temperature profile across the plate like this in the surrounding mantle, right? To track how the temperature in the crust, the surface of the plate would evolve over time, right? So just a very simple 1D heat equation approach built off some scaling relationships and other things that I developed based on the full numerical models of how this kind of regime behaves. And so here's a quick example. I think I'll just focus on this figure here. So this is showing the slab top geotherm, so basically the downgoing crust geotherm, for what I'm going to call modern style subduction. By modern style, I mean a style of subduction where the plate boundary itself has basically no resistance to slab sinking. So these are the models I was talking about earlier, where the plate then just sinks very fast and very steeply into the mantle. Right. So if you follow this, right, the the top of the plate, the downgoing crust heats up a little bit, right, but not nearly enough to cross into regions where it can melt to form TTGs. On the other hand, if I use this sluggish subduction style that comes out of my models of grain damage, where now there's resistance to plate sinking from the plate boundary, and that slows down the plate sinking speed, right? Now the plate has much more time to heat up as it sinks, and it can cross into a region where it can potentially melt and form TTGs. All right, so I mapped this out in terms of the mantle temperature and the lithosphere thickness we're imagining a sinking plate has, right? So thicker lithospheres have more buoyancy force, so they want to sink faster. Thinner lithospheres have less buoyancy force, so they want to sink slower and provide more time for the slab to heat up, right? And then, of course, mantle temperature could influence the heating as well, right? But like I said, it has these two different effects, where if the mantle is hotter, that's reducing the strength of the mantle interior, the resistance to slab sinking from the mantle interior, right? But also it can provide more warming because you're just sinking into a hotter mantle, right? And so we map this out in terms of, again, this modern style subduction, where we assume that the plate boundaries are always really weak and never contribute to resisting slab sinking, versus this sluggish style subduction where the plate boundaries do contribute, right? And what we see is in the modern style subduction behavior, only this very narrow window of like very small, very thin lithospheres would ever lead to melting, right? So this is in plotting contours or colors of where this downgoing crust could potentially cross the wet solidus and melt, right? And actually, really, just for completeness, allowed this to happen kind of at any depth. But in reality, we really should be looking at depths less than, say, 100 or 70 kilometers. So there's only this tiny little sliver for this modern style subduction, right? And actually making the mantle hotter makes it worse for the same reasons we talked about before, that as you start sinking a plate into this lower viscosity mantle, it just sinks super fast and can't heat up, right? Alternatively, if we have this sluggish subduction behavior, right, now because we have this resistance from the plate boundary, right, that really dominates, right? And the viscosity of the mantle interior doesn't matter as much for the plate speed anymore, right? So now as we increase the mantle temperature, we actually see an enhancement of the region where slab melting can occur, right, to potentially form TTGs, because we are now getting the heating effect from a hotter mantle rather than making plates just sink too fast, right? So we see a much larger area of kind of parameters that would allow slab melting with a sluggish style of subduction versus modern style subduction. All right, another important effect of this is, so in these models, I basically just treated the lithosphere thickness of the sinking plate as a free parameter, but in reality, there will be a kind of consistent lithosphere thickness based on how fast plates are moving. So the vigor of convection helps set how thick the lithosphere should be, and then that lithosphere thickness also in turn determines how fast a plate will sink based on its buoyancy, right? So I check this to see where is everything kind of self-consistent in the model, right? And so these white dashed lines on these two plots this is the range that we could expect lithosphere thickness to actually be based on the convective vigor that comes out from the kind of plate speeds we get in the model, right? And then here the plates would be too thick, and here plates would be too thin than we'd expect, right? So what we really want to see is where this kind of white dashed region in between the white dashed lines lines up with our regions that allowed for slab melting to occur. Right, that basically never happens in the modern style subduction regime, but in the sluggish style subduction regime, it can happen for this kind of narrow, but it exists, window of parameter space here, right, where the mantle temperature is hot, so it's above, say, 1600 degrees C, and we have, not super thin, but relatively thin plates of something like 40 to 50 kilometers, right? So this kind of region, right, then everything could really work out to allow the plates to sink slow enough to heat up to actually melt the crust and potentially form TTGs that way as well, right? Another nice thing about this is because of this combination of how the expected lithosphere thickness versus the regions where crust could melt if we had that combination of sinking plate lithosphere thickness mantle temperature works out, right? We have this little window where everything is consistent only at higher mantle temperatures, right? So this means that actually as the mantle cools, we would expect plates to naturally get too thick, even in this sluggish subduction style regime, to ever be able to heat up enough to melt the downgoing crust. So that's a natural mechanism to kind of shut down slab melting as the mantle cools. Okay, let's get back to this heat budget idea, and then I'll wrap up here. So I talked about how if we just had this plateau melting with the relatively muted rates of volcanism we need to match the hafnium isotope observations, it's hard to balance out versus heat budget. If I look at the kind of heat flows we get based on the plate thicknesses that kind of fit within the right conditions that allow for crustal melting and potentially forming TTGs in subduction settings as well, right? That's a little higher. That's about 200 milliwatts per meter squared, 0.2 watts per meter squared, right? And if we're losing heat globally at that kind of rate, that's pretty much right in line with what we need to balance versus heat budget, right? So this kind of sluggish subduction style actually would work out well as a way to get enough heat out of the mantle that we seem like we can't get out just through volcanism and something like a plateau melting setting. All right, so I'll wrap up here and try to kind of summarize these different ideas. All right, so basically I showed that this plateau melting model, right, can work to form TTGs, right, and it can produce the trend in epsilon hafnium observations we see in the very early Earth before 3.6 billion years ago, but only if the rates of volcanism, particularly extrusive magnetism, are relatively low, right, and actually much lower than a heat pipe model. So I don't think a heat pipe model can work, right? And this can fit the observations, but it leaves open this question of how do we actually balance out versus heat budget? Do we need something else going on, right? So I think in conjunction with melting in a plateau setting like this, we could have also had some style of subduction happening, right, in other regions of the Earth, right? This style of subduction would allow for heat to get out in the kind of range we need. But I'm not sure if this kind of style of subduction that I think can create TTGs through slab melting is not necessarily the best way to make these very earliest TTGs, because it is very hard to make very shallow melting, as at least the Hadean complex indicates, right? So ultimately, my maybe kind of wishy-washy, but I think a lot of times the truth is in the middle for things like this. I don't really see any problem, and I'm really interested in trying to test this in the future with more work and really trying to see what scenarios can match the various observations we have with having really both of these kinds of processes happening at the same time, right? Thick ocean plateaus undergoing internal differentiation, and maybe that's where most of the crust we see from the very early Earth was made, but also having some type of subduction or other type of mobile behavior happening in other parts of the Earth, allowing the Earth to get its heat out and balance out the heat budget. All right, so I can stop there and take questions and discussions and whatever we all have time for. Right? So thanks for your attention, everyone.
Thanks, Brad. We're typically open for discussion until you kind of run out of energy or need to go somewhere else. So typically people raise a hand and we kind of call them, or people can write a question in the chat room, and I will try to watch chat room and hands raising. Okay. So anyone wants to start? Maybe I
ask a question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Jen.
Something really simple. You're worried about weakening the plates in the Hadean to allow the extra heat out. What about all the bolides? I mean, Earth was being pummeled until 3.8. It's sort of a problem that isn't there because you'd constantly be rupturing the lid and letting a lot of heat out. And
yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm also not sure how much bolides are letting, because bolides are also bringing in their own heat as well from impact.
well, that
and so the extent
but you've got an example of one, and it's the lucky rock that survived. Maybe it survived because it formed in a slightly atypical place that wasn't seeing the high heat flux.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's possible.
But I really liked your talk.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think like even if yeah, like it's certainly plausible that these oldest rocks we have formed in some atypical setting. But yeah, I mean, I think it's still interesting to show that like probably need some way to get heat out more efficiently in the rest of the Earth.
As long as I've got you on the hook here, I'll be bold and ask another question. In one of your later slides, you were talking about plateaus versus normal oceanic plates, referring to the Hadean. What are normal Hadean oceanic plates? There's no evidence for seafloor spreading. We haven't a clue what it was like, really.
Let's see. I don't. What did I call normal? Oh, maybe this. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Good question. I guess basically normal oceanic plate. I'm envisioning a plate with a thickness governed by the vigor of convection in like a mobile lid or sluggish kind of subduction.
So you're talking about a seafloor spreading center.
Essentially seafloor spreading, yeah.
But there's no evidence, no field evidence, no geological evidence for them until at least 2.5. And they only become, So anyway, I've hassled you long enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I'd sometimes, maybe I'm a little more like too cynical of a geodynamicist, but I feel like to me there's not a lot of evidence like there's lacking evidence for lots of stuff on the early Earth, right? So it's, I mean, I don't like to appeal too much to things we don't have evidence for because that's a kind of scary place to be. But also, yeah, like it's hard to find evidence for lots of different processes that could have been happening on the early Earth.
Okay. Paul has a question. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
Any comment on a paper that I think came out yesterday in Nature, which I confess I haven't read yet, to the effect that based on titanium isotopes, it is argued that slab melting is much more common in the modern than has been generally considered.
Interesting. I haven't seen that because it just came out yesterday. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, and next, Jean Quinn. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Brad. Very nice talk, and also very glad to see you on Zoom. I'm a geochemist, so I will ask a question on that aspect. So, in the different subduction mode you mentioned, what are the differences it will make to, say, the outgassing rate of incompatible element like sulfur?
Good question. So basically you're asking like if we had some, something like this sluggish style of subduction I'm talking about, how that would affect outgassing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a regime like this, we would still have outgassing from kind of the same types of settings we have on the modern Earth. So there should still be outgassing from things like mid-ocean ridges. This particular model doesn't have is all internally heating, but there could still be plumes causing outgassing. And if we're taking volatiles down along a kind of subducting or sluggish subduction type of behavior like this, then we could be outgassing volatiles going down that way. I think in general, like these would probably, all of those outgassing processes, except maybe of the plume outgassing, although it still kind of relates to this, would be scaling in some way with the plate speed. So one prediction would be if you assume plate tectonics happened throughout Earth's history, and it was always a very modern style of plate tectonics, the simplest models predict like very, very rapid plate speeds in the early Earth. And that would produce like very, much more rapid outgassing than we have today. A style like this would produce more muted outgassing, probably similar to what kinds of outgassing rates we have today, because it would basically the rates of melt production would be scaling pretty strongly with the plate speed. I'm not really sure like specifically how sulfur might come into it. But if it's outgassing for the same kinds of, in the same kind of way that we like CO2 and water outgas, then at the same kind of settings, then yeah, you'd expect maybe a little bit elevated rates compared to today, but not like massively elevated that you would predict for really rapid modern style plate tectonics all the way back in time.
Thanks.
We have a question in the chat. I think it was to everyone, but I'll read it. Perhaps a minor point, but in your models, what is the protocrust, basaltic, komatitic, or andesitic, like the moon?
Yeah, I'm basically assuming essentially a basaltic type of protocrust.
Okay. Any other questions? Maybe I ask for clarification. So in your model, in your failed model, I was kind of, I didn't totally get why hafnium ratios would flatten out. Do you imply that with high rate of extrusive, high rate of volcanism would be very fast burial and melting of this volcanic rock with contribution from the mantle, because we normalize into Chur, and it's kind of, since Chur evolving over time, this ratios should follow the slope.
Yeah, it's flattening out because like this the negative sloping trend is coming from like the more time that some rock has to sit at the surface and decay on this different slope compared to Chur, the more it can get like mismatched from Chur, right? And so then these are flattening out compared to the like slope from some, say, like initial protocrust that just sits there, because like basically we're imagining that we extract some rock from the mantle, you know, maybe here, like at this time, and then it takes, you know, however much, like maybe tens of millions of years for that rock to get buried down deep enough. You know, use these columns, right, to where it reaches the region where it can melt, and then it remelts, right? So the crust always has, like, once we've gotten rid of all of this initial protocrust and we're just remelting the volcanic extruded crust, right? The crust always has basically approximately the same time from when it is extracted to when it makes it down to the melting depth. So it always has basically this, about the same amount of time to like pick up this mismatch from Chur, but it can't keep going more and more negative. So it like effectively flattens out.
So if I understand, you mean that you basically progressively adding new component from the mantle and remelting it, and the starting point for each of them will be shifting.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, I have one question in the chat. It's actually a comment from Sendur. Wonderful talk. I had a really simple question that was worked by Dr. Taras Geriye from Zurich, which was based around the segmentation of subduction slabs and how that leads to slab breakoff. For some of the calculations were for Neoproterozoic. Does this affect the sluggish subduction?
Does this fit? Yeah, I mean that if that's the paper I'm thinking of, that is actually also a damage effect. So I was talking about this grain size evolution rheology that I was using in my models, and in the paper I'm thinking of with Taras Geriye, he found slabs could segment and break because of this effective damage, right, causing them to break like that. So then that doesn't necessarily require, so in my sluggish subduction I'm talking about, that's where we have a plate boundary that gets effectively stronger compared to the underlying mantle, right? Really because the mantle itself is getting weaker and weaker as the Earth gets hotter going back in time, while the plate boundary itself is not getting much weaker. The make up with that, right? So we get the slab can easily neck and tear apart because it gets this kind of mismatch in forces. It's being resisted at the surface, right, and wants to sink down really easily in the interior, so it wants to stretch and pull apart. So the tar scoria paper we're talking about really, I would say, it provides other mechanisms, other ways that can cause slabs to segment and neck and fall apart, even without having effectively stronger plate boundaries like I'm talking about could have happened on the early Earth.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Brad? I don't see anything in chat. Maybe we give another minute for people for last minute question. But next week on January 25th, we will have a talk by Akshay Mehra. Alex will announce it, I guess, probably later this week or over the weekend. And I presume Akshay will talk about something sedimentary aspects, maybe related to stromatolites. Okay, so we have a full schedule. The only spot we have open before summer, May 23rd. And if you have suggestions for speakers, send me, because I right now trying to fill the spot. Okay.
There's a new question in the chat.
Thanks, Brad.
Oh, there is something in the chat. So, thanks. Okay, Paul, not Paul Hoffman, but other Paul wrote, what lutetium hafnium did you use for the pattern in this figure?
Yeah, I used, I think it's 0.015. I used a value that I know is like kind of a standard Archean lutetium hafnium ratio based on talking with my colleagues like Jesse Remick and Annie. But yeah, I think it's 0.015. I don't remember off the top of my head, but yeah. And that sets, that really helps sets what this slope is and the negative epsilon hafnium trend.
Does it answer your question, Paul?
No, I was just curious. I sort of get nervous when people put these evolution curves up there without giving us both sets of parameters.
Yeah, it's a good point. I should have listed that. But yeah, I know it's a kind of standard lutetium hafnium value used for models like this for the early Earth. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head.
Yeah, but it's a crustal value.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you're talking about though here is basically residence times and an evolution of the epsilon hafnium value.
Mm-hmm.
So the crustal value is not really appropriate, is it?
So this is the epsilon hafnium evolution in a crustal packet, like a packet of crust that formed in the early Earth and is then sitting at Earth's surface and then being remelted to form the TTGs.
Yeah, that's possible, I guess. I would have to go back and look, but it seems to me it's not changing rapidly enough.
Okay, what part is not changing rapidly enough?
Well, you can't see my pointer, but you're starting off at time 0 and epsilon hafnium at 0. And you're at only minus 0.2 in 10 or 15, 10, 12 million years.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd have to go back and look, but it just doesn't grab me as being correct. And then this is other business about the flattening out is related to that in the sense that the flattening out has to represent or has to be underlain by some very large scale mass balance considerations. But we can't turn the Earth off, right? So melting's going to continue.
Mm-hmm.
one place or another. And in this case, you're using basically the model that Fred Barker and colleagues put forth in the mid-1980s, where you had oceanic, in quotes, plateaus, someplace where they would grow in an aqueous environment. And that in this environment, then as the plateau thickened, the basal hydrated mafic rocks would then melt and yield TTGs.
Mm-hmm.
What Hafnium gives us here is some insight into the rate of those things, but it doesn't help us with the volumetric component, right? So it just strikes me as a little simplistic, I guess I'd say.
Okay.
Because to level this out requires a very delicate mass balance for, in your diagram, 500 million years. That seems challenging.
All right. Well, yeah. So that's interesting. Yeah, interesting thoughts. I haven't looked. We haven't looked at the exact volumes of TTGs we'd be making from this mechanism. So that's like another aspect that we'll look at in the future. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, because otherwise your pattern is replicated in several cratons. The time frames are different, but the basic pattern of progressively more negative epsilon hafnium with time, and then it looks like it's being, I wouldn't say buffered, but it's being it's in the process of being altered with more juvenile components. And so this is a pattern we see all over the place. So it's, at least qualitatively, it's very appealing, but it really requires some quantitative consideration of the volumes involved, because doing this with ratios is only part of the issue, part of the problem. So I hope you do that.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good point. And also, I'll just point out for like a figure like this that we're looking at, like we're really, we run the model for a long time just to, see how these trends evolve, but we're really focused on just looking at the kind of early phase where we have this negative slope, and then, assuming that probably some other process might kick in as a way to form the TTGs, like once that trend has stopped. So I don't really think the model, like beyond where we're kind of melting the initial protocrust, is like as applicable to what might have been actually happening on the early Earth.
Well, this basic time epsilon hafnium pattern that you have here, like I said, you see this in lots of places, lots of cratons. But the time frame varies from one craton to another and can in fact extend for at least 500 million years.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff moving around.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
There is a quick question from Sindur. How important were large, low shear velocity provinces in determining where local tectonic patterns regimes?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I really don't know if there would be any importance. I mean, early Earth tectonics is speculative. The evolution of large low shear velocities back into the early Earth would be really, really speculative. So whether they were still sites that helped anchor plumes or anything like that on the early Earth, I think is really hard to tell. So I don't have too much to add to that because I'm not sure what could even really be done to test whether the LSVPs were having an important influence on early Earth melting and tectonics or not.
Okay, thanks. So unless we have a last minute question, we probably should let Brad go and get dinner or maybe beer. Thanks, Brad, for presentation, and we look forward to more presentation on plate tectonics before the summer. Thanks, everyone. See you next week. Bye.
Thanks, Brad.
Bye, thanks, everyone.